Gotta go.
Hey, guy, you're the first serious gamer I've seen all morning. Check this out. Brand new 16-bit Super Nintendo with Super Mario World. Wow!
What's this one?
Oh, this is a Sonic the Hedgehog from Sega Genesis. Hey, look at these radical colors, huh?
Wow, Sonic's fast, too.
No, over here.
I like Genesis, and it costs a lot less.
Wait, kid, that game
I'll
there.
take Sonic and Genesis.
I knew that.
Sonic the Hedgehog. More action, more speed. Sega Genesis, it's a whole lot more for less.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Growing Up Gaming. This time we're going to be talking about the Sega Genesis. This is the third time I've tried to record this. For various reasons it hasn't worked, so I'm hoping that today is the lucky day. But I mean, as you may have gathered from coming to my channel, you'll know that, of course, the Sega Genesis is a pretty important console for me personally. Obviously, Generation 16 being built around the history of that system. But as I've mentioned in previous episodes of this series, the NES was really the system that made me fall in love with video games, and so I was a hardcore Nintendo kid through and through into 1990 and 1991. And of course, if you were a Nintendo kid, especially steeped in Nintendo power, you were ready for the Super Nintendo. That was the whole thing. Like, that was what you were seeing in magazines. You were getting updates on the Super Famicom when it was coming here. What games were going to be out there. Super Mario Brothers 4, I think it was being called at the time. Super Mario World was going to be a big deal. F-Zero looked amazing. Every new screenshot you saw looked incredible for the Super Nintendo. But for me personally, I was super excited about that, but I was also getting impatient because right around the same time is, at least in my opinion, in North America, was when the Genesis was starting to gain momentum. And actually, as I record this video, the most recent complete series of Generation 16 is from 1990. And 1990 was a hell of a year for that system. There were so many great games that came out, not only in North America, but stuff that you were seeing from Japan too, some great shooters and things like that. And so that was a thing. And then the other thing that was happening at that time was Sega was, of course, ramping up on Sonic the Hedgehog, which looked incredible. And they'd been super quiet about it for quite a while, but you were starting to see, you'd see the odd screenshot here and there, and you'd read the rumor about it and how it was going to be amazing and everything like that. So going into 1991, my resolve as far as waiting for the Super Nintendo was definitely starting to crack a little bit. And one of the things that kind of held that at bay was that video game rental stores were obviously ubiquitous back then. Everybody, when the Nintendo was at the height of its power, everybody was renting Nintendo games. There was a corner store that was right down the street from where I'm sitting right now, where I grew up, and it didn't really rent movies, but it did rent NES games. There was just a little shelf where you could rent NES games, and it wasn't weird to go anywhere. You go to the grocery store and they rented Nintendo games. But the thing was is that they didn't rent anything else. I never saw Master System. Like, my experience with Master System was the one friend I knew who had one. I ended up borrowing his for a while and playing like Rampage and I think Phantasy Star and things like that. And you never saw Genesis. No one rented Genesis around here. So while I was interested in the Genesis, I didn't have access to one. But that all changed early in 1991, where I just happened to find, and I don't even know how I found it, but I happened to find a little store in Halifax that rented the Sega Genesis, and obviously some games. And so I talked my dad into putting down the $200 deposit, which was something you did back then. When you rented a system, you had to have an adult with a credit card who would put down, I think some people use cash, but normally they would want you to use a credit card, where they just put a $200 hold on your card and you'd rent the system in a couple games. So I got my dad to do that, and I rented Genesis with Forgotten Worlds and Super Monaco GP. Now, Forgotten Worlds was good, and I was hanging out with a buddy of mine that night. We were having a sleepover at his place, and we liked Forgotten Worlds because it was two-player. It looked and sounded better than anything on the NES in my mind at that point. But of course, again, if my channel is something that you normally follow, you also know that I'm a big race fan. And Super Monaco GP was just in another world. Like, I was a big fan of Rad Racer, I was a big fan of Al Unser Jr.'s Turbo Racing, I think it was called, on the NES. There were some great racing games on the NES, but nothing came close to Super Monaco GP. And being sort of at that point, sort of a very early on F1 fan and an Ayrton Senna fan, Super Monaco GP just spoke to me. Like, there was something about the way it looked. It just looked better than anything I'd seen. For me, I think the thing that I was most impressed by was the fact that you could see the driver's hands on the wheel, and he would turn the wheel as you were driving through. But I mean, it was a very 3D looking game. It had weather and everything like that. It had all those great digitized images of the cars, and I kind of fell in love with it. So that kind of started me itching for a Genesis, and of course I had to buy it myself, buy systems myself at that point. We did get our NES as a Christmas gift, but my father was pretty clear on the fact that he wasn't interested in giving us video games and video game consoles for Christmases and birthdays and things like that. So I knew I'd have to get it myself, and I had a paper route so I could save up some money and that sort of thing. But really, the reason I'm saying that is that it came down to I'd probably be able to get one or the other, Genesis or Super Nintendo. And I finally got to the point that I didn't want to wait for the Super Nintendo any longer. And that was especially, I think there were two factors there, three maybe. So one of them was that EGM, in its 1991 buyer's guide, had actually awarded the Genesis as System of the Year. And excuse me for my system just made a noise there. Awarded the Genesis as System of the Year for 1990. I believe Strider won Game of the Year. Monaco GP won an award. Phantasy Star 2 won an award. And so it was kind of starting to gain, again, like I said, gain momentum. And to my sort of Nintendo-soaked brain, seeing this other sort of upstart new Sega console starting to gather some of the plaudits that normally Nintendo and its games would get, got me interested. And then playing it got me really interested, and I think I rented it a couple more times. I'm not sure what other games I ended up renting with it. I remember when I would rent it, I'd take it around to my friends' places and show them all the different games I would rent, and everybody was so impressed, but nobody was really wanted to bite on a Genesis. They were all waiting for Super Nintendo. The other thing was, I believe I can't remember how early it was, but I think in 1991 was when they started talking about what would become the Sega CD, the Mega CD. I think EGM broke that story with like some illustrations of what the system might look like, and just the fact that it was coming. And that was right around the time we didn't have a computer, but a friend of mine, they got their first computer that had a CD-ROM drive. So I had a little bit of experience in what a CD-ROM drive would bring to gaming. And I was excited about it. I was really excited about that, actually. And I think probably I think I was in junior high at that point, and our library had one PC that had a CD-ROM drive, and you could get time on that, and we had things like Compton's Encyclopedia, or whatever it called. I have no idea if it was Compton's, but it was multimedia. And so, you were getting full motion video clips about that big. They were postage stamp size, but it didn't matter. To me, that was magic. That was amazing. And so, this was the promise of that happening. And I think in my mind, it seemed like Sega's plans for this were very set in stone, where I don't even know if Nintendo was talking about doing a CD-ROM drive for the Super Famicom at that point. And if they were, I don't remember how deep into the controversy we were, but of course they were like partnered with Sony, and then they weren't, and they were partnered with Philips, and then they weren't, and it seemed like an endless tease. And then of course the other thing was Sonic. Information started to come out about Sonic. It looked amazing. Of course, at this point, you weren't getting videos on the internet. I didn't have access to the internet anyway, even if it was around at that point. But the screenshots looked incredible. All the coverage was incredible. Everyone was saying what an amazing game it was. And, Mario World looked amazing too, but it looked like Mario 3. It looked like a shinier version of Mario 3. Nothing wrong with that. But, I was being enticed by what was different at that point. And Sonic just spoke to me. Like, I was right in the proper age group, proper age range, proper gender, I was the person that Sega was targeting with their Genesis does what Nintendo don't ads. And that Sega was targeting with Sonic and sort of the attitude and everything like that, you know. The Sega Scream ads hadn't started yet, and blast processing wasn't a thing, but the shades of it were there. And, you know, I was, in 1991, I would have been 14 or 15. So, you know, I was that perfect age where it's like, well, some of, you know, are Nintendo games too kiddie? Like, I kind of want to go where the cool kids are, where the party is, that sort of thing. And so the Genesis just spoke to me. So I did end up finally making the choice that I was going to forego getting a Super Nintendo because I wanted a Genesis and I wanted Sonic. And, of course, didn't have the money for it. So what I ended up doing is I had a pretty decent collection of Nintendo games and a pretty decent collection of Game Boy games. And I ended up trading almost all of that stuff for a Genesis in like a bargain hunter. Like if you grew up in the 90s, you probably remember this. In some areas, they might still exist. But it was around here. It was called Bargain Hunter, and it was a free paper. It's just a pamphlet, really, but that had ads in it. You saw them at the back of magazines all the time too. But it was just a buy, sell, and trade paper. You could just pick it up at the local corner store, and there was a video game section, and somebody was getting rid of. I think they were getting rid of a Genesis and a TurboGrafx, which I wasn't interested in. In hindsight, it would have been great to hang on to that, but I ended up trading my Nintendo and Game Boy and probably about 30 or so games for a Genesis with no games, a TurboGrafx with I think a couple of games, and that was it. So I ended up getting that, and I turned around and sold the TurboGrafx pretty much immediately, but I didn't have any games for my Genesis. So I ended up going into the back pages of like an EGM or something. I think it was Chips and Bits was the mail order company, which, again, if you were reading magazines in the 90s, you probably remember Chips and Bits, and ended up buying Altered Beast, because it was all I could afford. It was like $3. I remember it was a $3 game, and shipped that to Canada, and couldn't wait, because I had this Genesis sitting there, nothing to play on it, and just waited and waited for Altered Beast to show up. So I remember getting Altered Beast, and super excited that I got it. Plugged it in and played it the first time. Thought it was amazing. 20 minutes later, I'd finished the game, and I had nothing but regret. I didn't hate it, but it's just like, wow, that was over fast. But the other thing was of course, because of the way I got my Genesis, I didn't get a copy of Sonic. So I ended up waiting a while before I actually bought a copy of Sonic the Hedgehog. But when I did, I was like hooked, and I still am. To this day, Sonic, the first Sonic game, is my favorite Sonic game. I'm not going to sit here and say it's like objectively the best, but it was such a touchstone moment for me as a gamer and for my love of gaming. Sonic was just on a whole other level. And so I was just so happy I made the choice that I made. And yeah, and of course I think it didn't hurt that the first couple levels in Sonic are so supremely polished that you just can't help but love it, in my opinion. Great music and everything. It really was a cut above anything I'd played on the Genesis. But that being said, because of finding those rental stores, you were starting to see it happen throughout the city too, was that the Genesis was gaining momentum, especially post-Sonic, and you were starting to see places that hadn't normally sold or rented Genesis games were starting to carry them. So I was getting more access. So I'd gone back and I was playing things like Thunder Force 3 for that first year, and Castle of Illusion was incredible, and Michael Jackson's Moonwalker was amazing. And so, you know, and it all felt so shiny and new because, again, my experience up to that point outside of the Atari 2600 had been the NES and the Game Boy. So while when I got a Genesis, I had sort of reservations because my favorite game companies didn't necessarily make Genesis games. So, you know, I was giving up Capcom games and Konami games and Squaresoft games because I was a big Final Fantasy fan. But I didn't, after that first few months, I didn't care because there were so many interesting experiences that were already on the system that, you know, I'd never played a lot of Sega games. I'd never played a lot of games from Technosoft or any of that. So it was like, or Electronic Arts. So it worked for me. So it was great. I didn't regret it at all. Again, there were little pangs of it here and there, but for the most part, I was happy. Oh, Ghostbusters is another one. I'm sort of checking my notes here while I'm doing this. And then 1991, Sonic carried on, and people kind of forget how big that year was outside of Sonic the Hedgehog. So of course, Super Nintendo came out. I didn't buy one. My best friend ended up one, so I did get to play it a little bit. But again, I never really regretted it, because I remember, like, Super Mario World, awesome game. And again, probably objectively a better game. But I was absolutely in love with Sonic the Hedgehog, and I really enjoyed Sonic the Hedgehog a lot. Shining in the Darkness came out in 1991. Again, I was an RPG guy. The system wasn't known for RPGs. I did play through Phantasy Star 2, and I think Phantasy Star 3 was the first game I actually bought, full price game that I might have bought with my own money for the Genesis outside of Sonic. And I played the hell out of that, and I didn't like it as much as Phantasy Star 2, but I did enjoy it. But then Shining in the Darkness came out, and again, that set a new standard, in my opinion, and having just played it recently in the last couple years, played through it again, that set a new standard for RPGs on the Genesis. And actually, it's funny because now, as an adult, I go back and I troll through old Japanese magazines, and you can tell that Sega knew it had something special with Shining in the Darkness back when it was getting ready to come out, because the coverage for that game leading up to its release was just relentless. But again, got that. Absolutely loved it. Final Fight was on the Super Nintendo, but of course we had Streets of Rage. And Streets of Rage was, and is, an objectively better game than Final Fight. Never mind Streets of Rage 2 even. And so it was just really cool to be part of that groundswell, and again, be part of the sort of scrappy underdog, and be a fan of that system and have that system, because you felt like you were part of something special, and you felt like you were part of sort of the, dare I say, anti-establishment in video games, in this full-on console warrior. I was absolutely in. And, with EA coming through too, I've never really been a big sports guy, still not. I mean, the sports that I love now, I love because my son and my daughters play them. But, back then, I didn't really play organized sports. I had tried baseball. I had played hockey, not organized hockey, but I would go out on the pond with my friends and play around, usually play goalie because I didn't have to skate very much. But I did love hockey video games. On the NES, my brother and I had played hours of ice hockey and Blades of Steel. And again, it was 1991 where NHL Hockey came out from Electronic Arts, which, while Madden was probably the more important release, and I'd say Lakers vs. Celtics was probably the more important release, and those have both come out in late 1990, I had zero interest in football or basketball. But I did have interest in hockey, enough that I would sit and watch it. My brother played it, so we'd go to his games. I would play it a little bit with my friends on the pond. And of course, my dad was a huge hockey fan. So Hockey Night in Canada was on every week, especially if the Bruins were playing. And even if they weren't, it was on. So it was a thing, right? It was, that old stereotype, Canadian kid, grow up around hockey. Even if you don't love it, you grow up around it. At least I did. So when NHL Hockey came out, again in 1991, on the Genesis, that was another touchstone game because it was so unlike any hockey game. Again, ice hockey and Blades of Steel were the two that I'd really played. It was so unlike either of those. Those were very arcadey and they were great games. But NHL Hockey, first of all, it changed the view to a vertical view, which I thought was really cool. But it felt more real, and it felt more. Those two games were great pick up and play games for like 5 minutes, but NHL Hockey was like, if you were really into it, you could set up a whole season, and it was tracking stats within the games, and I think it had a replay mode, which was pretty cool at the time too. That wasn't something you saw in sports video games up to that point. I mean, Madden 92 might have done it. I don't remember, but because I didn't play Madden 92, but I did play NHL Hockey. And it's funny because although Sonic is credited with making the Genesis obviously popular the world over, or at least in North America, and really picking up the pace and bringing Sega into the fight with Nintendo. For me and my friends, and I'm curious if this was Canada-wide, but I know for me and my friends, when I showed my friends Sonic, they thought it was really cool. But I don't remember any of my friends going out and getting a Genesis because of Sonic. When I took my Genesis around or had people come over and we played NHL hockey, I know of at least 4 people who ended up buying a Genesis when we were teenagers because of NHL hockey. That was the game that sold them a Genesis, because there was nothing like it on the Super Nintendo. There was nothing like it on the NES. So NHL Hockey 1991 from Electronic Arts was chef's kiss. It was great. Electronic Arts that year too, I think that was the year that they released The Immortal. The Immortal was this really cool Will Harvey adventure game from the PC that had come to the NES. I think it was the first Electronic Arts game I ever played, and I actually owned it on the NES, and I loved it because I was really, really into fantasy and sword and sorcery stuff, and reading through Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and that sort of thing as well. And oh my gosh, I can't even remember all the names. There was like a series of AD&D youth books. Any youth book that had dragons and swords and magic in it, I was reading. So I loved The Immortal, and saw that it was available on the Genesis, and ended up making some trades at a store that I discovered that ended up getting my hands on it, and it was so much better than the NES game. And the NES game was great, but of course the claim to fame for the Genesis one is that it had all the blood and gore that had been in the original computer game. So like when you would fight orcs and you get the killing blow, like your wizard would like slice him in half or lop his head off or turn him to stone and he crumbled to dust, and it all came along with these really gory graphics and all these great sound effects, and especially the really like mushy sound effects that were just absolutely gross, but I, as a 15-year-old, I totally loved it. So that first year of having a Genesis was really great. And the thing was that even because 1991 was a big year for Sega and was a big year for the Genesis, and even as all that was happening, and they started to really gain momentum to the point that they were like neck and neck with Nintendo, because the Super Nintendo had a bit of it was a popular launch, but it was also a bit of a troubled launch, because if you remember, there was one big thing about the Super Nintendo was kind of a victim of the popularity of the NES in a way, from a public relations standpoint, because everyone had lots of NES games, and when the Super Nintendo came out, of course, it wasn't backwards compatible. I think they tried to do that at one point, and it didn't happen. But the Genesis, of course, you could get the power base converter, which I remember speaking to Al Nielsen, who was the marketing guy at Sega at the time. And I don't remember if he said this to me directly, or I read that they said this in another interview somewhere. But it was pretty much, I think it was from him who said this, where it was like the power base converter was not a successful peripheral, but it was an important peripheral, because when all that was happening with Nintendo, Sega could say, if you owned a Master System and you have games, you can play them on the Genesis. And it was just like one of the most important peripherals that nobody bought, I think was the quote. I'd have to look it up, but I always thought that was great. But so anyway, Sega's cachet was building. It was getting really popular. It was starting to pull neck and neck. But the thing that I always loved about Sega during those years, during the first half of the 90s, was that they kind of never lost that underdog mentality. And it really led to them releasing a lot of games that I think you wouldn't have seen elsewhere. Like Toe Jam and Earl is a perfect example. I didn't feel like Toe Jam and Earl would appear on a Super Nintendo. It was just sort of this really great experimental game, really funny. And I believe that Toe Jam and Earl were up for like the mascot contest that Sonic ended up becoming the mascot. But, what a great two-player game. Introduced roguelikes. I think that's the right word. I don't know for sure if it's roguelite or roguelikes to me, and I think to a lot of console gamers. And then you had like Echo the Dolphin. And I remember reading about Echo the Dolphin and being like, why in the world would you play a game where you star as a dolphin? It's insane. And then on top of that, it being like actually a really good science fiction story. Like, just, again, super experimental stuff that I just didn't feel like Nintendo would take a chance on. And, you know, to their credit, because they had a market position that I think they didn't want to lose, obviously, whereas Sega was fighting. But even as they were starting to go neck and neck, and I mean, there was at least one year, I think, where they ended up outselling Nintendo from, I think, a console standpoint. I don't really know. That it just felt like they never gave up that sort of underdog mentality, and it was really great. And then the other thing was that as time wore on, like I said, when I first grabbed a Genesis, I was a little bit worried because I was sort of leaving behind some of my favorite developers. And there was this whole controversy at that point too, again, that was starting to build up in video game magazines, where Nintendo had these really draconian licensing rules, where if you created games for the NES, I think it was that you couldn't release the same game on a competing console within a year or something like that. I think that was the rule. And so it really kept a lot of big third-party developers out of the pool on the Genesis side. That and the fact that, of course, you know, the Genesis wasn't super popular in Japan, so if you didn't want to put your money into that console, of course, you weren't going to. But when the groundswell started to happen, and I really sort of put this around Batman for the Genesis, because that was the one that I remember EGM talking about how great Batman was for the Genesis, and how North American gamers would probably never get to play it unless they imported it. And they even had a contest where you could win an imported copy of Batman for the Sega Genesis or Sega Mega Drive. And to me, it felt like that really built up the resentment against this whole thing. Plus, at the same time, I think Nintendo was being investigated for monopolistic business practices. There was an anti-Nintendo sentiment happening at that point, and Tengen and Atari were going after them like crazy as well. So when they really released their third parties, and they said, okay, you know what? You don't need to stick with just us. You can release games on whatever console you want. That really opened the floodgates. And the fact that Sonic had been so successful, Sonic 2 was even more successful, and the Genesis was getting more and more popular, you know, then all of a sudden, hey, look, we've got a Castlevania coming. We've got a Contra coming. Street Fighter 2 is finally coming to the Genesis. Mega Man, although unfortunately it never got a retail release here, but, you know, oh, look, the first 3 Mega Man games remastered for the Genesis. You just were getting and Acclaim started, as much as we want to laugh at Acclaim supporting the Genesis was huge, you know, and you just, it was a legitimate competitor. In the Master System years, you didn't get that. In the Master System years, you just like, well, of course this didn't show up on the Master System. Who the heck owns a Master System? You know, but you got to the point where a lot of major games were released day and date with each other, or very close to each other, on both consoles, similar to how it is now, although there was one major difference. But, you know, again, it was so cool to be part of that rising tide and be part of that group that was like in on the ground floor. And even today, I love looking and watching people discover old Genesis games if they weren't Genesis gamers. This is the same with the Saturn too, where, you know, it feels like such a well-kept secret amongst those of us who were around and were playing them at the time, but so many people discovering these old games that they didn't really ever play or didn't know existed was great. One of the other things that I absolutely loved about owning a Genesis, and actually owning both systems back then, that I want to touch on, that I just sort of touched on a second ago, is that even when you had similar licenses, or even if they weren't licenses, but just, you know, different games from the same publishers, a lot of times they were actually different games. Now, sometimes that meant that you got like the lesser version on one console or the other, but that wasn't always the case, and that was, again, one of the things that I loved. And I constantly look at games like Alien 3 is a wonderful example. Alien 3 on the Genesis is a completely different game than Alien 3 on the Super Nintendo, even though they were both released by Acclaim. Both great games for different reasons. I loved that Mortal Kombat, of course, were on both systems. The Genesis one was better. Not just because of the blood, but because I think it played better, personally. You know, you had Street Fighter 2 and Super Street Fighter 2. better on different consoles for different reasons, which leads into the 6-button controller, which is still one of my favorite controllers of all time. The Genesis 6-button, which is sitting down on the floor, but I can't reach it. But even things like Shadowrun on the Super Nintendo, completely different from the Genesis. 2 great games. Aladdin on the Super Nintendo, completely different from the Genesis. 2 great games. And you were getting stuff like that happening all the time, and it was so cool to be part of that. Especially, it would happen a lot if Sega still tended to pick up a lot of licenses that third parties had for the Super Nintendo. The other thing too was, of course, being in on the ground floor on the Genesis. As is with any console, it was amazing to see the games improve. If you go back and look at the early Genesis games, they look good. The arcade conversions, they're decent. But even when you get to like Castle of Illusion and Sonic and everything, like they look incredible. But then the Genesis was where I felt like these huge leaps were made when you got to like Aladdin, and all of a sudden it looks like you're playing a cartoon. And I feel like we never really got to that point on the Super Nintendo until maybe I'll back that off and say probably Yoshi's Island. But it looked like you were playing a cartoon, something I would never have expected in 1991 when we finally got it. And then when you had Treasure come in, I mean, they were absolutely a treasure, and they were supporting the Genesis. You were getting all their games on the Genesis and nowhere else, and they were doing amazing things with that console. Konami was doing amazing things with the console, different to the amazing things they were doing on the Super Nintendo. So there was, even as the markets started to, and the releases started to homogenize a little bit, there were still reasons to own both consoles. So I did end up getting a Super Nintendo eventually, but I never ever regretted being on the Genesis side. So yeah, I mean, that, to me, that was kind of, and then we got into the release of the Sega CD, which I'm going to do a separate video on because the Sega CD is also a very important console to me. But again, it was really cool. And you got into the Sega Scream stuff, and they were just doing so many great things. But there were a couple other elements to the Genesis that were kind of formative for me as well. I'd mentioned probably in the NES video about getting into video game magazines. But with the Genesis, I really got hardcore into that. And it was because I think of some different magazines that were on the market. So I mentioned at the beginning of this video how one of the things that kind of got me to the point where I wanted to get a Genesis was that EGM was really talking it up. Now, that makes a lot of sense in hindsight. EGM was founded by arcade gamers, really big, good arcade gamers. So the fact that the Genesis was meant to bring the arcade home and did so well, doesn't surprise me that the EGM guys were into Genesis. But I did find that after probably around 92, they started to really back off on that stance a little bit. But I think it was 92, maybe 93. It must have been 93, because around the same time, that was when Die Hard Game Fan was starting up. And they were obviously hardcore Sega fans. They promoted anything Sega did on the console front like crazy, in the way that only Game Fan could. They were just so super excited about everything they were excited about. And they did such a great job with that. And so it was really fun to be sort of into magazines at the time, because there were so many different voices, but those two were the two that I was really interested in. And I remember having debates with friends of mine, and also just commiserating with them when EGM would crap on a Sega thing. Whereas Die Hard would just be like, rah, rah. They were like cheerleaders for everything. And I remember going through magazines, and especially Game Fan, because their screenshots were so great, going through with a fine-tooth comb. I remember when Street Fighter II Special Champion Edition was coming out, Game Fan ran a ton of screenshots, and they were actually screenshots from, I think, a pre-release version where there was some significant changes, I believe, by the time it came out. But I remember going through and comparing that to what we were looking at on the screen with like Street Fighter 2 on the Super Nintendo at the time, and figuring out like how the letterboxing was different and how the life bars were different, and just like scrutinizing every little detail. And it was the same with like Mortal Kombat. And I remember their coverage of Shinobi 3 was incredible again, because they covered the version that never actually came to stores, but they would run so many screenshots, and we weren't using magnifying glasses, but it was pretty close. Like, you'd sit there and just pick them apart like crazy. But it was great, and for me, it was formative from a standpoint of it really cemented that that's what I wanted to do as a career. That kind of became my dream. I didn't want to necessarily work on games, but I wanted to work in games, and I really felt like the media was where I belonged when it came to that. Reading these magazines, and it's funny because going back and reading them now at an older age and a little bit more sophisticated, some of the writing was not great, but at the time, and for the audience they were aiming it at, which again was me, the MTV generation. It's weird for me to say that. I'm Canadian. We didn't have MTV, but that's who those magazines were really talking to. It was me. So I felt, very invested in it. And the more that I read these magazines and the more that I read this coverage, the more that I started to think, because I was like, again, 15, 16, 17 at the time, trying to figure out what I want to do with my life, thinking like, well, I'm a pretty decent writer. And, I felt like I was a decent critic. I think this might be what I want to do. And, reading this stuff more and more, like, I can do this. I could write the way these people are writing. I could break down a game to its core pieces and tell you what's exciting about it and tell you what I think should be different and how it should be better and just critic stuff. And so, like, looking back on it now and sifting through some of those old issues that were coming out in the early 90s, for me, that was absolutely a sort of a formative moment where I'm like, from a professional standpoint, where, 15, 16-year-old me was like, this is something I would love to do. Now, I didn't know how to make that happen in Nova Scotia in the early 90s. There was no games industry. There is now. I didn't even know where to begin. That was something that people who already lived in Chicago, or I didn't even know where these people were based, but, lived in Chicago, lived in California, those were jobs that they got. I didn't even know where to start. I didn't have a sense of what a portfolio was or how to build that. But all I knew is that it was around that time that I was starting to realize that, this is something that I think I could do. This is something that I want to do. And, in later years would pick that up and decide, this is my career. This is what I'm going to do. From a personal, and actually, sorry, just to tie that off, I am going to do a further video, because the way that did happen is actually more during the late 90s, was getting online, the rise of the internet and fan sites. And I have a whole episode planned around getting into fan sites, starting Gaming Age and stuff like that. So hopefully we'll get that off the ground here very soon, and that'll be one of the upcoming episodes. From a personal standpoint, also, the Genesis was important to me because it really it landed me one of my best friends, still to this day one of my dearest friends. We've been very close now for, I don't know, 30 years. So how that worked was, again, video game rentals and sales. There weren't a lot of places that had Genesis. However, there was a place called Game World here over in Dartmouth, which is the next city over. And so it was in an industrial park. There was a park over there where my family used to store its race car, which, I mean, how many times have you heard this story? You must know millions of people who their family stored a race car somewhere. But no, my family stored its, my uncle drove a race car and my dad was co-owner. And we had a sponsor this one year that had a garage over in Dartmouth, and that was where we stored the car. It used to be stored here in my home, actually right beneath me, in the basement beneath me, where I'm sitting right now. But this was a bigger space. So that's where the car was stored. So my dad would spend almost every night working on that car. And on weekends he would go over, and that's when they would do, when they weren't racing, they would go over there and work on the car. And so that was one of the things that I would do on weekends when I didn't have anything else to do, which was pretty consistent. I would go over to Dartmouth and help my dad work on the race car, usually clean up the shop and stuff like that. And one time I remember going over there and we were driving down this row, because it was an industrial park, so it was all commercial and, properties all over the place. And we drove by a sign that said Game World. And it was about 2 blocks up from where we were going. And I was like, oh, I wonder what that is. So I said, like, after I was done cleaning the shop, I was asked, can I walk up and just see what this place is? Yep, no problem. So I went up there and I walked in, and it was this tiny little store, but it was a rental store. But the cool thing about it was, it didn't just have Nintendo, it didn't just have Genesis, it had like everything. I think it had TurboGrafx, definitely had Neo Geo. When I walked in, I remember there was somebody standing there playing a Neo Geo, which was like, whoa. Like, I'd heard of them, but I'd never seen one. They were playing NAM 75. And anyway, sort of became a place where I would hang out. I would go over to help my dad on usually Saturday mornings, and then when I was done, I would go hang out at Game World. And I mean hang out. And that was a normal thing. And again, I want to do a video upcoming about rental stores in the 90s as well, because I ended up working in them and managing them. And it was not weird, especially it was a game-specific store where we had stuff on display on demo that you could play. It was not weird for groups of kids to just hang out at the store. And if it was a cool store, they were fine with that. And this place was cool. All the places I ran were cool too. But so I would end up going and just hanging out for an hour or so. Would play some games on demo, but I ended up getting really close with the staff. And one guy in particular named Jim, we ended up really hitting it off. And it actually got to the point where we formed a friendship that morphed from me just going and hanging out for an hour to like going over in the morning or in the afternoon even to help my dad at the store or at the race car shop, and then going to the store if Jim was working and hanging out for hours. And then when he would close the store, I'd go back to his place and we'd hang out for a couple more hours playing video games, because we were both big Sega fans. And the nice thing about working at a video rental store was, of course, if you were working morning shift the next day and you were closing that night and there was something on the shelf that hadn't been rented, then you could just take it home. You didn't need to pay for rent. We would sign it out, but you didn't need to pay to rent it or that sort of thing. And I remember doing that multiple times. And Streets of Rage was a favorite of both of ours, still a favorite of mine. And I remember multiple times being there when we would be closing the store and Streets of Rage 2 was still in stock. And Jim would just look at me, and it sounds stupid to say it here, but it's how we did it. He would just look at me and just say, "Want to rage?" I was like, "Yeah, let's do it." And he'd sign out Streets of Rage 2, and we'd take it back, and we'd play through it. We ended up ending up playing through it a lot on Nightmare. But the whole reason I bring that up is because that was how I got exposed to a lot of the Genesis library as well, was that store. And like I did end up working, not at that particular store, but when they expanded, I ended up working in retail at Game World for a while, amongst other places, and that is again an upcoming video that I want to do. But overall, that ended up being, and it still is, one of the most lasting friendships I've ever made. Jim and I are still very close. We still hang out usually every week, and through thick and thin, and through marriages, and me moving away and me coming back, and me moving away and me coming back again. So it's another reason why I think I have such a fondness for the Genesis, is because it actually was another piece of the puzzle in me setting off on my career path, but then also at a very personal level, as one of my closest friendships was formed out of the Genesis years. So it means a lot to me. I'm gonna check my notes one sec here, because I'm sure there's more I want to talk about. So anyway, yeah, that was what it was like. That's sort of some of the things that I remember when I think about the Genesis. But I mean, it's had such a long-reaching effect outside of even getting me started on a career and friendships that were formed. Of course, when I decided that I wanted to become a content creator, I wanted to use my YouTube channel for something more than electronic news gathering demos that were never going to be used to get me a job. The very first video I ever uploaded to my YouTube channel was my ENG demo when I went back to school 17 years ago. But no, when I decided I wanted to be a creator, I figured, what system is important to me, and the Genesis popped out. Genesis and the Sega CD popped out, and it's been great to go back and re-experience those games. This has been one of the most fun parts. My Generation 16 videos do take a long time to come out, which sucks, but it's because they've become so much more than just quick one-off reviews of old games. For one thing, it's been a chance to discover a lot of games that came out before I even owned the system, and it's in the timeline that I'm in at this moment, where the previous video I released before this video was the Gain Ground episode, which was the first game to be released in 1991 for the Mega Drive. So we're actually getting near the point where I finally bought the system. So up until this point, a lot of these games, if they weren't sort of the main, the big ones like Altered Beast and Phantasy Star 2 and Thunder Force 3 and stuff like that, I hadn't played them. So it's been great to discover them. But also, going back to getting into the games journalism side of things, I've been able to stretch those, flex those muscles as well into what the way the series has gone and what the series has kind of morphed into by being able to reach out to creators and chat with them and talk about the creation of these games. So it's kind of a nice meshing of my passions, which, my passion for playing games in general, and also for sort of digging into them a little bit more and being critical about them, but also learning how they were made and sort of the challenges and the context of it. It's all great. It's all been great. But the other thing that I love about, that I have loved to see over the last X number of years, is that there's such a thriving fan-made games industry, with the Genesis in particular, which I find really interesting because from like the retro gaming sort of content creator standpoint, it's always felt like the Genesis definitely plays second fiddle. And I think that's probably fair, because worldwide, well, at least in the major territories, I feel like the Super Nintendo, while maybe it didn't have more success right out of the gate outside of Japan, it had more staying power. Because that was one of the things being a fan too, is like, yes, we had the Sega CD and we had the 32X and we had the early launch of the Saturn, and Sega kind of squandered the goodwill that it had. And I've done a previous video about this too. But while all that was happening and Sega was kind of on the decline, Nintendo was still hitting its stride with the Super Nintendo, which makes sense. The Super Nintendo was 2 years newer than the Genesis, than the Mega Drive. So, what Sega was enjoying in like 94, you were seeing that level in the Super Nintendo like 95, 96. But it's been interesting to see in retrospect, because the retro YouTubing community in particular is very Nintendo-centric, very pro-Nintendo. Again, it's not undeserved, but it's noticeable. But there have been so many great games, and there's so much support for the Genesis in that retro community, especially from the standpoint of fan-made games. It's been incredible to watch, and it's been really cool to see. I haven't ended up buying all of them, but I've ended up, grabbing a lot of these games, and a lot of that stuff is really good. So it's been heartwarming to see that. And again, I guess it's further justification for being such a big fan of that console. It's been so much fun to watch people jump in and find old games on that console that I ended up experiencing 30 years ago, but people are seeing for the first time ever now. They're new to them. It's been very cool to see. So I think, going through my notes and everything, that pretty much covers it. Of course, there are tons of games on that system that I could probably talk about for hours and hours, but that's not really what I want these videos to be. Like I'm glancing across at my Genesis shelf there and seeing like Road Rash staring back at me, and Shinobi and Quackshot and Ghostbusters and the NHL series, and there's a lot of stuff up there. There's a lot of great games, and sooner or later I might do game specific videos, but that's just been sort of me and my experience growing up, getting a Sega Genesis in the early 90s and what it was like to be a Genesis owner. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you continue to enjoy these series. I really enjoy taking these trips down memory lane. The next one of these will be about the Super Nintendo, because while I didn't get a Super Nintendo in 1991 when it came out, my best friend did, so I was playing it and I had thoughts about it. I didn't think I was going to buy one, and then, Final Fantasy III happened. So I did end up buying one, and I do have some pretty strong memories about the Super Nintendo as well. So the next Growing Up Gaming episode, whenever that might come out, will be about the Super Nintendo. But I am going to branch off and not do console-specific things as well down the line. I have a couple things that I'm pretty excited about, and I hope you will be too. So in the meantime, thank you so much for watching this. What were your memories of the Genesis, of the Sega Genesis? Did you own one? Did you get one instead of a Super Nintendo? Were you part of the console wars? Did you get into arguments on the playground, or I guess if you were a little bit older, maybe not the playground, about which games were better? Like, what were your favorite games? Leave comments down below. These videos always end up having great comment sections, and that's the thing that I love about this the most. So I really hope you will leave a comment. If you have liked this, please like it. Please share it around to your friends, and please consider supporting the show on Patreon. I would really appreciate that. Ended up purchasing a few different things with that money that I think has helped the quality of this video. So anyway, again, thank you so much. Please leave a comment. I hope you enjoyed this. I'm Greg Stewart, and I'll see you all next time.